Hello, everybody. My name is Adam Thorne, and welcome to the Australian Aviation Podcast. I am joined, as ever, by my two co-hosts, who I will now introduce. Chris Fenton, welcome to the show.
Hello, how are we?
Doing very well, thank you.
Good to hear.
And Jake Nelson, welcome to the show.
Hello, how are we?
Doing very well. We also have a special, I say guest, a sort of semi-guest. I'll give him the big introduction because you may have seen the name Robert Doherty on our website occasionally. And that's because Rob predominantly writes for our kind of sister brand, Defence Connect. It's like Australian Aviation, but not as good and operating to lower standards. But we do have a bit of crossover. And so sometimes if we're, say, writing about the RAF, you may see Rob's byline. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Adam. And I feel like maybe I'm a bit of a co-pilot. Maybe I'm the dead leg sort of, tagging along for the ride.
Ooh, see what he did there?
I see what you did there.
Maybe chock.
Yeah, could be the chock. Although I will say my knowledge of passenger aircraft a little bit limited. If we start talking about military aircraft, I may be able to help out there somewhere.
Don't put yourself down. You're in the big leagues now.
Yeah.
You know, I can't have the excuses coming in early on.
Well, I mean, Qantas and Virgin might start fitting missiles to their planes to, if they see each other in the skies. So
Yes.
you never know.
Right, anyway, before we go down that crazy tangent, and I will explain why Rob is here a little bit later, but it's at this point in the show now that we do our special messages, shout-outs, thank yous to the fans. Chris, what have we got this week?
Yes, so this week, just a reminder to all of our listeners and viewers that tickets are still on sale to the Night of Nights.
The Oscars of Aviation.
The Oscars of Aviation.
Have we nailed down a proper name for that yet?
no,
We've had a lot of suggestions.
We've had a couple of really good suggestions, and I did like the one last week that you didn't like.
The Thornies?
The Thornies.
I don't know.
huge, yeah.
It's too... there's something about it that's just that just doesn't feel, I don't know, collaborative.
Does it sting a bit when you hear it?
No, but it's a bit of a prick on the finger.
Nice. Well, that was borderline, isn't it? Borderline.
Back to what I was saying, we still do have tickets available to the Night of Nights. So anyone out there listening or viewing that want to purchase a ticket, it's held at the Star in Sydney on the 31st of August. Tickets are available. It is a black tie night. Call the beautiful Lizzie from our delegate sales team here at Momentum Media. You can reach Lizzie on 02 for Sydney 8357 5440. That is 02 for Sydney 8357 5440. But you'll remember, listeners, last week we mentioned that we're doing a membership drive for our fantastic website, australianaviation.com.au, that has undergone a beautiful facelift, bit of a nip tuck. And any person who is Sydney-based that uses or that signs up to become a member of Australian Aviation using the discount code podcast prior to the 20th of August will go into the draw to win 2 tickets for themselves and a guest to the Black Tie event to be a guest of either Adam or myself on the Night of Nights.
A priceless prize in many ways. You couldn't put a value on it.
The value.
Mainly because it's worthless.
That's about a VIP experience, I would have thought.
It's a major VIP experience. So sign up today. Don't delay. Visit australianaviation.com.au, or if you do want to attend the night, there is still opportunity to purchase tickets. Tickets are selling fast. They're going out like hotcakes, which is fantastic, but be there or be square.
Get on it.
Absolutely.
I've got a shout out as well for Hayden McDonald out in Esperance. He's 21 years old. He's going to embark very soon on a Australia-wide odyssey to sort of raise understanding of neurodivergence and autism because he is on the spectrum himself, and he has big dreams of being a pilot. And I spoke to him today for a future podcast, and he did sort of hint that he was a listener. So if you're listening today, Hayden, hello, and good luck on your trip.
Yeah, best of luck, Hayden. That's awesome.
Wow. Now we will move on to the main part of the show. Now, as many of you know, myself, Jake, and Chris, we're constantly flying business. We're flying first class. Obviously. But the problem with this, of course, is often when this happens, it's the airlines obviously put us on there, and they treat us like gods and kings because, obviously. But the problem is that can in many ways skew your opinion, because I sort of think this is not the same experience as the punters get. You know, this is not the same experience the little people get, and that's always something that's made our jobs very difficult. But Rob here, he works for Defence Connect. He went on a quite incredible trip a couple of weeks ago, and his end destination was Hamburg, I believe, to look at some shipyards. But he was also flew this trip flying a variety of airlines, a variety of aircraft, and also some fantastic business class experiences, including one part of his trip being on QF1. Now, when I heard this, I thought we've got one of our guys going incognito who can talk us through this experience. This is proper journalism at its absolute finest. Rob, start at the beginning and talk us through your trip.
Thanks, Adam. So it's very much undercover. You know, we don't all have that luxury of being recognised when we step on the flight. But when you say one part of the trip was with QF1, that was a significant part. That was 24 hours.
24 hours.
So that was from Sydney through Shanghai Airport in Singapore through to Heathrow in London. And let me tell you, that's a great aircraft. And flying business class on there, I was able to work quite well. The workstations they have, great for laptops, good space there. The seats are pretty comfy, but there was some difficulties in that there were some delays heading out of Sydney, and a couple of hours there sort of spent on the runway just seeing what would happen after some faults with the air conditioning there. And that delay caused so much of a delay that by the time I got to Heathrow, I had previously had a 5-hour stopover in Heathrow, and that was cut down to 2 hours.
Wow.
Well, I suppose at least that you didn't miss your next flight. So in a sense, that worked out quite well. How would you kind of rate how the staff and the crew reacted to that delay? Because you're on the tarmac. Were you well looked after in that time?
Yeah, so we were offered sort of, beverages when we got on. This is in business class, of course. And the seats, as I said before, they were quite comfy. There wasn't a lot of information being given around apart from the fact that it was an issue with the aircon. And when we did get off the ground and get to Singapore, that issue obviously wasn't resolved because we had then more of a delay there before heading out to London. So I would say that, as sort of my first experience in terms of business class, that was quite good. And it's certainly a huge step up from economy. But the delay was sort of definitely something I was thinking about at the time.
So what's interesting is that QF1 business, arguably, you're not just selling the airline, you're selling Australia here. This is the kind of the most iconic, the most important thing. Talk us a little bit more about this. How would you rate the food? Because Qantas and its Neil Perry menu, very, very, don't snigger, Chris, they're very, very big on this. How would you rate this? How would you review it?
Considering it was a 24-hour flight, I actually think I slept through most of that part. But I will say that in the return flight, which was a A380 with Emirates, which was operated by Emirates, that there was a completely different experience because the Emirates seats have more of a tourism feel for business class. They don't have that working space on the way back. So certainly heading there on QF1, I was able to work on a laptop and it was an easy thing to do. Completely different experience on the way back.
And then talk us through the next part of your trip, because you had a variety of aircraft and a variety of airlines.
So heading through to the British Airways, so this is from Heathrow to Hamburg. This is the A319 aircraft. That was a 2-hour flight, fairly sort of self-explanatory. The business class was checked out much the same as the QF1, and I probably preferred that than the flight back as well.
That's quite interesting.
Wow.
Are you saying that British Airways, that the English are trumping the Australians? It does seem to be what you're suggesting here.
I think they are, yeah.
Wow.
So I think that there's an approach there that says in Europe, we need a business class for business people, so they need somewhere to work. They need that sort of peace and quiet to be able to work and somewhere to plug in. And I think there's definitely some airlines out there, like the flight that I got back with Emirates, where it doesn't have the same professional workspace and it's more about the comfort and luxury level, the gold bling everywhere, the bar, things like that.
One of the things that's quite interesting is that a lot of how we view long-haul flying and international flights is based on reputation from big airlines like Emirates, Qantas, British Airways pre-COVID. And what we know during COVID is that a lot of airlines obviously let go a lot of people, or they had a lot of new staff on board, that kind of cuts were made. And so I think often what we're finding is that at the other side of COVID, the kind of almost the rankings of what airline is good is changed a lot. I'm very surprised to hear you rave about British Airways, because arguably this is an airline that had a poor reputation. I know it struggled for a lot of time in the UK. And Emirates would have been an airline you would have thought had the very best reputation. But your experiences suggest that actually British Airways was the best. Am I right?
Yeah, that's right. So, and that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I hadn't even really heard of British Airways in Australia. But certainly the advertising you get hit with here for Emirates is huge. Any sort of major sporting event, you're getting some Emirates advertising. And so it was a huge shock to get on that flight back and think, well, this wasn't as good on the way there. It sort of didn't have the same facilities. And it's obviously for a different purpose. I don't know whether that's changed during COVID, but it definitely seemed like there was less of a focus on being able to work and get things done. And even it came down to small things like being able to plug in with a charger, using your laptop into the flight. On the flight back, which was that Emirates flight, the 14 hours, my charger wasn't compatible with the aircraft. And I had an Australian outlet. I had an adapter with a European adapter. So I had everything there to be able to plug it in. But the voltage wasn't powerful enough in the system to actually charge my laptop.
And that's extraordinary because, without being smart, if you're travelling business, the reason you're meant to be travelling business is so that you can work during the flight. That's the rationale for the companies paying for it. If you can't even charge your laptop, that's a big thing to get wrong.
Yeah. And bearing in mind, I have a pretty heavy-duty laptop, but I still thought, this is a bit average, you're sort of running it down to the lowest percentage possible at work, and then thinking, well, I'd have no other choice now. It's time to watch some sort of outdated movies on the TV.
I want to bring you in here, Chris, as people may or not be aware. Chris has held every single job in aviation other than flying the plane. But one of the jobs he had for the bulk of his career, for a large part of his career, was being a cabin crew manager. Chris, does this feedback surprise you? Because you've obviously been on hundreds or thousands of flights. What's your kind of thinking of Rob's review here?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting, and I guess product is subjective. Rob was exactly right. Emirates is extremely heavy-handed with advertising and marketing in the Australian market, but they do that globally. Emirates is known as a global airline. They try and get their finger in as many pies as they can with sporting teams and sporting ventures all around the world, as do all big three Middle Eastern carriers, Emirates, Etihad, and Qatar Airways as well. To hear that Rob had a more enjoyable experience on a Qantas aircraft than an Emirates aircraft is surprising. Because traditionally it's the flip side. But Rob is correct. The Emirates product is themed around the luxury and the opulence of the product that you're purchasing and paying for. But look, there's also been a number of reports recently from both Australia and New Zealand where Emirates have been sued for not having the product advertised or an out-of-date business class product. So, yeah, it's I'm not surprised by it. It's interesting to hear British Airways, though.
One of the I'm interested to hear that because obviously being another POM in Australia, even British Airways has a bad reputation or had a bad reputation in the UK for 10, 15 years. And the reason was because sort of 15, probably more than this, 20 years ago, you had this kind of low-cost revolution around Europe. You had, Ryanair and EasyJet and all of these airlines. And British Airways kind of got stuck in the middle. They didn't know whether they were meant to go and try to compete with these low-cost carriers or whether they were meant to keep their kind of premium service. And what happened is they kind of got a bit stuck in the middle. There was plenty of strikes, a lot of disruption, and it felt that their reputation really, really went downhill. I know they have, I think it was in the last year or so, got a new CEO, and his kind of big thrust is to try to make British Airways a true premium airline again, really invest in customer service and all of those little perks that he feels has gone missing. And it's interesting, your feedback here, Rob, suggests that they actually are doing quite a good job.
Yeah, so I think part of this as well, from my own experience, was that with QF1 and the British Airways flight, the actual seating is you get your own sort of booth. That's I'm not sure if it's leather or not. It was some sort of black, upholstery, and it's very much like one of those lazy boy sort of chairs. It's got a bit more room to it, and it sort of folds down. And then when I came back through the Emirates flight, very much an upright thing, and you're a bit closer to the person next to you. You don't have quite as much room in terms of around your arms, things like that, where you would normally want to have a laptop on the desk in front of you and then maybe have a mouse or something like that. You don't have that room, so that upright approach, maybe that's better for looking out the window and for drinking a champagne, but that's not really what I wanted when I was wanting to work.
Yeah.
Well, I've sat in business class on a Qantas Streamliner before. To be clear, I haven't flown business class. I just sat there for a bit. It was
That's
nice.
a bit different though, yeah.
Well, it was nice for the 10, 20 seconds that I sat in it. But I have had an experience with I have flown with Emirates before in economy because the company that was flying me out there wasn't going to pay for business. But
not the company you're currently at, to be very clear.
No, that sitting in that business class seat on the Dreamliner on the tarmac's probably the closest I'm ever going to get. But with that Emirates flight, I do sympathise with your story of the delay. Though your delay was with Qantas, obviously, but I did fly Emirates to Zurich via Dubai for a previous job in a previous life, and we were delayed coming out of Sydney, and so it wasn't even a 2-hour stopover in Dubai. It was literally race us through the airport to get to the connecting flight to Zurich, and my baggage didn't arrive till the following day. So that was my experience with Emirates. To be clear, the flights were nice, but it was all sort of marred by the baggage thing.
I would like to make a call out here, and this is a problem that I ran into with Emirates during the trip. And I don't want to rain on their parade, but this was a fundamental issue that I think probably needs to be resolved in the aircraft industry. I'm not sure how widespread it is, but when we were in Hamburg Airport and you have your ticket and you're checking into the desk, you obviously want to get your bag put through and then head to a lounge. And this is business class people and economy. They want to do the same thing. You want to go about your way and get out of that main entrance hall, which is chock full of people. That didn't actually happen because I found that the aircrew that were manning the front desk, they were counting down to when that front desk opened. And there was no way that I could check my bag in early and then go to a lounge. Because if I got to the lounge with my bag, that meant that I didn't have any ID or ticket to get into the actual lounge. And I needed to get that from the actual Emirates stand, which wasn't open. So it was a catch-22. I'm stuck in the main hall with everyone else, hundreds of people. Everyone's waiting for the same thing. And at that point, I did see sort of the economy passengers as well being sort of ushered out of the line because it's not open yet. That terminal wasn't open yet.
Must be nice to get to go to a lounge. Never been to a lounge. Been to the gate lounge.
If any airlines are listening, we can't have that situation to go anymore. Someone get the man into a lounge.
Got to get into a lounge
Someone
at
get
some
him
point.
into a lounge.
There's airlines opening lounges all over the place. Got to get me into a lounge. By the way, on the subject we touched earlier, you mentioned about England trumping Australia. I well know that the Matildas are going to be playing England soon, so we'll see who trumps who.
Are they though?
Yeah.
I know they're both through to the quarters. Is that going to be?
I'm pretty sure that the Matildas are going to be playing England. They're going to be facing England in the semis.
Well, commiserations on that loss.
I see you're practicing what to say to yourself in the mirror.
Right, now, before we wrap up this section of the show, Rob, obviously Rob is a modest man, a man of the people, down to earth, working class hero. We all know, salt of the earth kind of fella. You spoke to me before. You said you'd never flown business before. How much better do you think the business class experience is? Would you ever be tempted to pay out of your own packet for it, your own wallet for it, or is it just the icing on the cake? Does it make that much of a difference?
I do think it makes a huge difference, and any of the business classes I went on were a huge improvement over economy. In saying that, there was a huge cost involved, and I think that business class for me personally on my own personal trip would only be worth it if I had a hugely long haul flight that was 24 hours. Now, I've flown to the US for 13 hours in economy, and I think I'd do that again. But if it was going to be more than that, I might consider upgrading to business class now that I have been on the trip. I would also like to add that I didn't only take business class on the trip. There was an economy flight with Wizz Air Hungary, and that's an A320. That was from Varna in Bulgaria back to Hamburg, Germany. And I will say that there was some issues highlighted on that flight, which I found just crazy, that, passengers, it was almost an understanding that when you land, before the seatbelt button goes off, the light, everyone's sort of standing up and racing for the exit with nowhere to go. And I thought that was incredibly odd. And I also thought it was odd that people getting onto that flight had their duty-free bags, these yellow duty-free bags, which we all had. We all put them in the overhead locker, except by the time we got to the other end, when we had to then open the overhead lockers, everyone had the same bag and couldn't figure out which duty-free bag they had. So that's probably something to discuss another day. But, that was my takeaways from that flight as well.
So that's how you get the plot of Home Alone 3.
Well, on that note, before you go into another tangent, we will move on. Rob, thank you. You've been a very, very good sport. Thank you very much for joining us.
Come back anytime,
Yeah,
Rob.
we're always
You're
welcome.
A friend
You're
of the family.
always welcome on the show. Okay, welcome back. So now we will steam into the week's news. Now, when we were talking last week, on last week's episode, we revealed that Bonza, kind of out of nowhere, announced that they were going to launch 11 new routes from a new base in the Gold Coast. And when they made this announcement, they said that this would happen via a wet lease agreement. And for those of you that aren't aware, wet lease is kind of industry mumbo jumbo for when you have another aircraft from another airline operate your flights, but you also have their crew do it as well. And they never actually said who the wet lease agreement was going to be. We sort of speculated incorrectly.
Very incorrectly.
With the
authority. Egg on our faces.
That it was going to be Alliance. We got it very wrong. And actually, they're going to be working with their sort of sister airline in Canada. Jake, talk us through this and what it means for the future of Bonza Legends.
Yeah, so we did speculate that it was going to be Alliance based on the fact that Alliance is based in Queensland and it's not affiliated with Rex. It seemed a logical choice at the time, but little did we realise that there was a more logical choice, which is, of course, Flair, a sister airline to Bonza, also sort of owned by 777 Partners, that also uses the MAX 8. I believe there were actually a couple of planes that had been earmarked for Bonza that went over to Flair because Flair was short of planes. But basically, the Flair aircraft and crew were going to fly Bonza-branded flights in the Australian summer, and then during the North American peak season, Bonza is going to send planes and people to Canada. So essentially, they're going to be using the same aircraft. I'm not sure if they're probably not going to repaint them every time. That'd be very expensive. But they're going to be using the same aircraft. It's just that over here, the Flair crews and aircraft will be operating Bonza flights, and they'll send Bonza planes and crew over to Canada to do Flair flights, which should be an interesting cultural exchange program.
Well, I mean, again, as another POM in Australia, I am not going to bemoan issues around migration. However, what I would say is that Bonza have built a lot of their brand on being this kind of true blue Aussie airline. They call their crew the Bonza Legends, and their aircraft name like Sheila and Bazza and all this kind of stuff. And what we're going to have is Canadian aircraft and Canadian crew operating Bonza flights. I think this is quite an innovative solution, but I could see how this is a tricky PR thing to navigate. Chris, what are your views on this? Because it does feel this is quite a tangent.
Personally, I think it's a recipe for disaster.
Big words from Chris.
Yeah.
Go on, Chris. Tell us.
There's a couple of things that spring to mind here. Number one, parent company, 777 Partners. Obviously, it makes sense for them to move aircraft between sister companies. What's not been reported widely here in Australia is that earlier this year, Flair had a heap of their aircraft repossessed for non-payment, leaving them with a shortage of aircraft, which is possibly why some of the Bonza allocated aircraft were reallocated to flare. And I think there's a bit more behind that story that I'm not across. Flare being a Canadian carrier, Canadians in general are warm and friendly, caring people. So I think...
And Australians absolutely are not.
Oh, we're the best. We're the best. But I think from a service point of view, it's going to be okay. I think where Bonza really need to make sure they play their cards right here is communicate efficiently and effectively to their consumers booking a flight ex the Gold Coast that the aircraft will be operated by Flare, with Flare crew and aircraft, because I can see poor old Mrs. Smith rocking up at the airport from, Gold Coast to Townsville, thinking she's getting on a Bonza aircraft with Bonza legends, looking for a purple aircraft, seeing a black and green aircraft with Flare crew, and being a bit confused when they talk Canadian with their Canadian accent. Yeah. Well, I think this can hurt the brand in the long run.
I do. I mean, I do see clearly when they were coming up with the Bonza Legend thing, this was not an idea that had come into mind. I think I said it was an innovative solution, and I'm going to bring you here, Jake. Obviously, the reason they've done this is it's now very hard just to get hold of any new aircraft, and it's actually very hard to find skilled, trained crew. That's they've kind of found a way around that. But surely, Jake, this is indicative of the kind of wider problems we've got in the industry at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the 737 MAX has been delayed and delayed and delayed so many times, and there were all those issues with reliability and safety a few years ago that Boeing seems to have solved. But we all know that it took Virgin ages to get their first 737 MAX 8. Monkey Maya, haven't forgotten. Lovely people over in Perth. It did take them ages to get their first 737 MAX 8. Bonza still only has the 4 of the MAX 8s. They're expecting the 5th sometime by the end of the year. And as we've discussed before, one of the issues with the MAX 8 is that it is a new plane and you need to train up pilots on the new plane. And so when some of those new planes are out of commission, then due to mechanical faults or bird strikes or whatever, then it's difficult to actually train the pilots up on them. This is one of the reasons why they axed 5 of their routes a month or so ago, was because they didn't have the planes and the crew to be flying all those 27 routes and making them economical. Now, obviously, they've added these 11 new routes from the Gold Coast, and these Flare planes are going to be helping with that. But it short of, again, partnering with someone like a Alliance, this was probably the most logical way to keep flying using the 737 MAX in Australia for an economical, through economical means.
It's interesting because this is a very innovative solution, and it actually reminds me of what we do with, and this might seem like a strange kind of analogy, but with bush firefighting aircraft, right? Exactly the same idea, that you have a bushfire season at one time of the year in the US, and you have a bushfire season at another time of the year in Australia. And so it makes sense to these countries, when they're not going to have much use for these aircraft, moving them around. Nonetheless, Canada to Australia is a long way to have a partnership. Chris, in your years of aviation, have you ever come across a wet lease scheme quite like this?
Yeah, look, wet leases are not that uncommon, and we touched on it recently with Qantas and Finnair. Air New Zealand wet lease as well, with a Spanish carrier, Vamos Air. So currently on the Perth-Auckland, Auckland-Perth route, it's a Vamos Air aircraft and crew. So a Spanish airline operating a flight for a Kiwi carrier, because Air New Zealand didn't have enough aircraft to sustain the route. So rather than cancel the route altogether, bring in a wet lease. So wet leases are very common. So are dry leases. Dry leases being when you lease the aircraft only, but not the crew, and it's your own crew operating the aircraft. So not uncommon. They happen all the time, all around the world, and there are airlines set up specifically for leasing, where they will either lease an entire aircraft and crew, or they will lease an aircraft only. So not that uncommon. I just think in the long run it will hurt Bonza's reputation, and you know how much I love Bonza and how much I'm rooting for Bonza to come out on top and stick it to all the others. But I think in the long run, if they do not play their cards right, this could potentially hurt them. The other thing that springs to mind for me on this, Adam, and I know I'm kind of going off the question that you asked me, is when it comes time for this to be reciprocated, when Bonza need to send an aircraft and crew over to Canada to assist Flair in their northern summer, that's going to leave Bonza short an aircraft and crew here. So what's it going to do to their schedule here when they lose an aircraft to go offshore to Canada? And as you rightly said, it's a long way to go to send an aircraft for a summer schedule.
Well, this was actually the second kind of big wet lease story of the year. And the first one was that Qantas were going to work with Finnair. And this is because basically Qantas are kind of short of wide body, traditionally international aircraft. And they've been struggling to get hold of new ones, as everyone's struggling to get hold of planes. And so they agreed this wet lease deal with Finnair to start, I think it is from Sydney to Singapore in late October, and then flights between Sydney and Bangkok from March next year. Now, this decision provoked a furious response from one of the pilots' unions, who basically said, I think it was like an absence of fleet planning that it would kind of come down to this. But it was sort of supported by the Flight Attendants Association of Australia, which is basically the kind of big cabin crew union. But Jake, we've seen a story this week that now they are sort of withdrawing their support and saying that they've been misled about the whole thing. Jake, talk us a little bit more about this.
Yeah, the Flight Attendants Association of Australia has said that they've accused Qantas of what they say is a breathtaking lack of transparency over the deal that will see the Finnair crew operate these flights. They've said that Qantas said that the agreement would save the jobs of Finnair staff who were doing it tough because of the situation in Russia, but they were later informed that the employees would be sourced from labour hire firms. Now, Qantas has denied this accusation, said it's been very upfront about the terms of the agreement, but the FAAA says, quote, Finnair use labour hire in a range of places around the world. However, it was presented to the FAAA that the arrangement would save the jobs of Finnair cabin crew, when in fact it's about expanding the offshore arrangements for Finnair with labour hire. The crew work for AAP, a labour hire provider, and not Finnair. Airlines around the world are driving down conditions of direct employees and offshoring their work where they can. And the union is also saying Qantas cabin crew are concerned that this is part of a wider offshoring strategy of Australian cabin crew for the Qantas group.
It is interesting because, again, this is yet more evidence that we're struggling to hold of planes, we're struggling to get hold of crew. This kind of skill shortage, this talent shortage in the aviation industry is very, very real. I think at the time that this Finnair, the Finnair deal was announced, and I think I said previously, one of the pilots' unions, called it a failure of fleet planning. How could a massive airline, globally recognised airline like Qantas, effectively go cap in hand to a relative minnow like Finnair? It feels that this is going to be one of the problems which is going to hinder Qantas and a lot of airlines' recoveries post-COVID, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes it's a case of poor fleet planning. Sometimes it's a case of we've got to go ahead to start a new route. We want to start that new route, but in order to start that new route, we need to pull an aircraft from somewhere else. The solution is a wet lease or a dry lease. It's tough. I feel for them. On the flip side of the FAAA argument, Qantas also use labour hire offshore as well. So they want to be or they want to tread very carefully here, because Qantas also do use labour hire offshore for Jetstar and certain flights with the Qantas group as well. So offshore labour hire companies are nothing new to aviation. They don't have the benefit of being employed by an airline full-time, but instead they're employed by a company and contracted to a specific airline to fly in that airline's uniform and aircraft. So it's nothing new to the sector, but it'll be interesting to see how all of this unfolds. Yeah.
Look, personally, I think that Qantas and Bonza will probably bounce back from this. I don't think Qantas is finished, and also Australia is the land of the flare go.
Well, there we go. For those of you
Boom-tish.
taking a shot for every joke and punny comes out, you'll be drunk now. You're already
Two shots,
You're
people.
already on the floor, aren't you? Okay, welcome back. So one of the kind of regular storylines or themes over the last few weeks has been the problems at Airservices Australia, which is the organisation that oversees air traffic control. And essentially, as a bit of background, this comes down to, I think, hundreds of occasions over the last year or so where airspace has been effectively closed. And what I mean by that is that rather than the person in the air traffic control tower talking to the pilots and kind of guiding the plane down, aircraft have been self-separating. So essentially they've been talking to one another. Now, Airservices Australia said this is due to sort of short-term and unplanned leave of controllers. So effectively it's kind of like people calling in sick. And they said it's not an underlying lack of controllers at all. They claim they've got 100 more people than they need, and they're also going to be hiring even more people. The critics, which now include Qantas as well as the unions, effectively are saying you do have a staff shortage problem. And what they're essentially saying, what they're effectively saying, is they're being clever with their terminology. They're saying, well, we do have enough people, but that's just because you've decided what that level is, and there is a problem. Now, Airservices Australia have been very bullish over the last few months that there is no problem. This is perfectly safe. This is perfectly normal. They are on top of this. We had a big update on this on Friday afternoon with a statement released from the Airservices Australia CEO. Jake, talk us a little bit about this.
Yeah, as you said, Adam, at maybe 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. Cheers, lads. But the CEO of Airservices Australia, Jason Harfield, put out this cover letter to the Australian Aviation Network overview, which Airservices says is an industry snapshot covering social and economic trends, our regional context, and performance of the Australian Aviation Network for the financial year. Now, Harfield, what he said was that he said that his organisation is not delivering the standard of service. He says, Airservices has not consistently delivered the service standard we expect of ourselves and relied upon by our customers and stakeholders. While aviation safety performance has been maintained, the efficiency and consistency of the network at times has been impacted and constrained, hampering the recovery. He said, I am committed to ensuring transparency and accountability for our ongoing performance to ensure we can effectively serve our customers day in and day out.
Now, what I would say about this, as you pointed out there, is that, well, firstly, that this is the first, or from what I'm aware, the first kind of public element of contrition here. This is saying we are falling short of the standards that are expecting of us, which not quite a U-turn, but that does feel a very significant moment in their communication. Two things here. This statement, and call me cynical, released on a Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. That is what it is. Whether this was planned or what have you. Obviously, the journalists, most good journalists, are down the pub. Sadly, I wasn't. But it's true. If you want to bury bad news, you do it on a Friday afternoon. And also, very significantly, within this statement, wasn't the word "I'm sorry," wasn't the word "apology" at all. If anything, it was when you look at what he wrote, it very much was like this is the situation that's been inflicted on us. I think that was very telling. What do you read into this, Jake? Because it was very much like sorry, not sorry.
Yeah, and I note that they don't. That the statement, at least what we're seeing here or what we've quoted here, doesn't say anything about staffing levels.
No.
It's please, Airservices, correct us if we're wrong. It does sort of read like that they're saying. The industry has a rapid recovery. There's still the significant volatility, the ongoing disruptive effects of the pandemic. The rate of recovery has not been uniform across the Australian network. Capital city airports are still 30 below. In international operations at capital city airports, still 30% below pre-pandemic levels, et cetera, et cetera. They do say regrettably, which is probably the closest they get to an apology in this statement. But it does sort of seem like rather than internal issues at Airservices that have been causing these problems, it's external factors that have put them in a situation that they didn't want to be in.
I always think it's very interesting with these things because not saying sorry sorry is always a purposeful decision. I would argue just generally is a cynical journalist, because if you are writing something like this, the most obvious first thing that springs to mind is to say, we are sorry, we apologise. So if you go to the lengths of not saying sorry, that is a statement. So, I mean, for me, if I were Airservices Australia and I would do this, I would have said sorry even if I wasn't sorry. I mean, it gives it something else. Chris, what's your reading of this? Because it does, to me, I feel that in many ways this is going to cause more trouble than it's worth. This statement's only going to make people more angry.
Yeah, look, I 100% agree with you, and I think it was poor form to send it at 3 p.m. on a Friday, where they would hope the story wouldn't be picked up or run, being dead news on a Friday. By the time the teams come back on a Monday, other stories have come in to kind of cover it up or move it further down the food chain. So I'm on the cynical pile with you. Everyone knows, the industry knows, there is clearly a problem with Airservices Australia. Come out and admit it.
Yeah, and I think we a couple of weeks ago, when Qantas kind of came out there and made a very strong statement where they blamed their reliability issues on staffing at Airservices Australia. I mean, at that point, I feel that the industry sort of totally swung against them then, because again, that would have been a purposeful decision by Qantas to make that statement. We had a follow-up story which dropped yesterday, which is very, very interesting, which is that a former head of the RAF has been appointed to the board of Airservices Australia. Now, this is Air Marshal or retired Air Marshal Mal Hutfield, who himself was a fighter pilot before rising up the ranks to become Air Marshal, and he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross in recognition of his performance during the Iraq War. Mal Hutfield, as you two newbies may not be aware, is a friend of the show and appeared himself on the Australian Aviation Podcast a few years ago. Now, while I don't claim to know the in-depth nuances of his career, Mal Hutfield is known as one of the very most respected people that has come through the Air Force in years. A man that's actually obviously been a fighter pilot himself and also worked those kind of management and admin roles, was very much a huge part of getting the RAF through the pandemic, getting to their 100-year anniversary, transitioning to new platforms. I would say, obviously, I know he's not the CEO, he's on the board. I feel his appointment is hugely significant, because I would say he's not the sort of character to, excuse my language, put up with any bullshit. I mean, if you got Mal Hutfield on the board and he sees something going wrong, I mean, he's the sort of person that would sort things out. I don't know if either of you two would agree with that.
Look, I personally don't know Mal at all, but from what I can say, the social posts that I've seen around the announcement of him being appointed to the board, it's lit up on LinkedIn and anywhere where we've or Australian Aviation have shared the story on our socials. Comments have flooded in saying what a wonderful appointment, fantastic appointment. So it's pretty clear he's extremely well respected in the industry, extremely liked in the industry, and seems like a guy that's just going to roll his sleeves up, get in there and whip it into shape, which is what needs to happen.
Exactly.
Here's hoping, yeah.
Right. Well, we're going to move on to the final story of the week, and I will let Jake talk about. We like to talk about Sky Kittens in Brisbane, but it seems like the Sky Kittens are now in Sydney. Jake, for those people that are unaware, talk us through what Sky Kittens are and what's going on in Sydney.
Well, Sky Kittens are planes, of course, Adam. We've agreed that we don't like the I mean, you two have agreed that we don't like the term aircraft noise
we hate that.
on this
Bleep
show.
Bleep that out in post production.
Well, then they won't know what we're talking about.
That's true.
That we don't like that we don't like that term on this show. So we call it the purring of Sky Kittens.
The lovely sound.
The lovely purring of Sky Kittens and their cuddles on nearby communities. Now, we have had some discussion around Sky Kittens in Sydney before, out at Western Sydney Airport. But in this case, we've got maintenance works at Sydney Airport that are likely to increase Sky Kitten purring in nearby suburbs for, they're saying, about 70 nights between now and the end of the year. So basically, Sydney Airport, they're going to be doing some maintenance on the main north-south runway. That's That's to make sure that's in shape. And so as a result of that, late night freight aircraft and other aircraft that use the airport after curfew, there are maybe 11 to 18 flights per night that do that between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. Overnight flights using the airport during the curfew will be using the parallel north-south runway instead. And what that will mean is that instead of flights being routed over over Botany Bay and Kurnell Sand Dunes, they will instead be going over suburbs in Sydney's southeast. So that's parts of Botany, La Perouse, Kurnell, Phillip Bay. And it's been said, reported in the Herald, that volumes of the purring could reach around 70 decibels overnight, or approximately as loud as a washing machine.
Call me cynical, but these things they never seem to happen in the run-up to an election, do they? No. I mean, all of that noise over those very influential seats there. I mean, by the time this is over, long way to the election, and that was just one observation.
Look,
I had.
Middle of the night, people should be sound asleep, and if you're already in a sleep, that noise shouldn't wake you up.
Of course it shouldn't do. Stop moaning.
Exactly.
So when I'm on Instagram, and I don't know about you, when I'm on Instagram, pretty much all I do is watch videos of golden retrievers, because what else is the point of Instagram,
Very
right?
true.
And a lot of the adverts I get served now are for these stupid contraptions where it's like a music player it's like in your pillow or in a blindfold, so you can listen to music. And people are getting something far better than music for free.
Absolutely.
It sounds fantastic.
Yep. Personally, I don't see an issue with it. They've given people notice. It's going to be very short term. Let's not get our knickers in a knot.
There is also another note. There will be a temporary closure for about 10 weeks, no more than 10 weeks, of the airport's east-west runway, apparently, to protect workers carrying out the construction on this new taxiways and airport parking bays. And the airport has said on its website, they've got a whole page about these major projects. Depending on which of Sydney Airport's flight paths is being used, the increase caused by the project will be between 1 and 6 flights spread across 17 hours between 6 a.m. and 11 p.m, or 3 to 5%. Some flight paths will see no change in the number of flights or fall to 0. So they're doing a lot of work over at the airport.
Question.
Answer.
There we go.
Have they covered? Well, as we know recently, we've covered it very much recently, all the cancellations in Sydney and the delays in Sydney when Sydney Airport has gone down to single-use runway, which often means the east-west runway, which they're closing. For how many days?
No more than 10 weeks, they say.
So for 10 weeks, the east-west runway could potentially be closed. So what happens if Sydney gets strong winds again and has to close the 2 parallel runways? Have they covered that?
Then I suppose the workers had better duck.
Well, thankfully, we've got a crack team of journalists here at Australian Aviation
We'll be on
ready
it.
to report any disruption. So if there's any delays, we are here to hold power to account.
Interesting, though, that they haven't covered that, because
No.
that has been an issue in Sydney of late, where Sydney has gone down to single-use runway, being the east-west runway.
If you're interested, by the way, the type of flights that usually use the airport overnight, things like emergency air ambulances, limited number of domestic freight and general aviation flights. So things like Australia Post Mail, food and perishables, radioactive isotopes, and e-commerce.
So what was the second to last one?
E-commerce? No, that was the last one.
No.
Radioactive isotopes. So I mean, if you're ordering a radioactive isotope sandwich on Amazon, then I suppose that sort of covers most of it there.
Well, on that note,
There you go.
On that note, we will wrap things up for the week, and I will thank my two co-hosts. Chris, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Go the Matildas.
And Jake, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Go the Matildas.
And we will be back the same time next week to celebrate a glorious English victory, and we'll be back then. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.